Welcome and thanks for joining us for another webinar from the Center for Agricultural Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm Ryan Evans with the Center for Ag Profitability, and I invite you to visit our website at cap.unl.edu for a list of all of our upcoming webinars, and you can find recordings, including this one that should be available later there today as well. And I'll be putting some links in the chat as we go here with that website, so you'll be able to find your way to it pretty easily. But we're glad to have you join us here for our next installment of a webinar that we first held a year or so ago, maybe. Now that you've inherited a farm, today we're looking at the important issue of understanding leases and clauses. So we aim today to help landowners and heirs better your understanding of leasing options and responsibilities. And that's if you're new to farmland management or navigating a lease for the first time, or you've been in it for a while. We hope that this session provides clear guidance and helpful resources. And we definitely welcome your questions to be typed into the Q&A panel at any time. And we should have some time at the end of the presentation to get to those. So please do enter those as they come to mind. And to present today, we are really fortunate to have Anastasia Meyer back with us. Anastasia is an extension educator and agricultural economist responsible for the southeast part of the state with the Center for Agricultural Profitability here. And Anastasia works a lot on issues with land management and leasing, as well as succession plan and transition planning. So again, questions are welcome for Anastasia if you have them, and I will turn it over to her now. So, Anastasia, thanks for being here.
Thanks for the great introduction, Ryan. So this series, so you inherited a farm or ranch, now what? How to understand your leases and clause. Like we said, it's a kind of the second installment of the series. That first one was kind of designed on the immediate things that you needed to do, understanding how you inherited that lease. What does that mean? What is the bare basics that you needed to do in the first 6 months or so? Going to the FSA office, the USDA, kind of explaining what all that is. Now it is the let's try to understand the leases and clauses and see what is important for your ground that you might have just inherited. So, with that, let's get started here. So, why leases matter? Chances are, if you are a landowner and you inherited ground, you're going to be looking at some sort of leases, whether it's verbal or a written lease. And leases truly matter because you are now having some legal and financial responsibilities that come with that piece of ground. So you are liable for different things. We'll cover that. You have to pay land taxes, but the most important thing I want to emphasize today is that a lease, especially a written lease, protects both the landowners and the tenants and our heirs. So this is why we are really pushing everyone to get a written lease, because we know that land is transitioning rapidly in the last few years and will continue to do so. And how do we protect ourselves and our heirs when that happens? Because we know that handshake deals can cause problems later on. It really kind of comes down to a he said, she said situation in a handshake agreement. That's when disagreements happen. That's when some feelings might come arise that they are feeling taken advantage of, or disgruntlement. The other person isn't here. We can't ask questions. So let's try to stop that and have our leases in writing. Some common situations that we see when people inherit land is that either you are inheriting land that was owned by a loved one, or you already have a tenant that is farming it. If you have a tenant that you inherited, the first question that you need to ask is there a lease? Is there a written lease? Because whatever that written lease says, you either need to follow that or adjust it for the next year. We also see that when land is passed down, it's often getting passed down to multiple heirs. And not every single time do those heirs agree on things, whether it is the rental rate, the management style, who is farming it, do they want to sell it? Those are all common disagreements that we see when land's passed on. So You're not alone if you have that. We have different resources available for you, but really, who's the primary person for that one piece of ground? If multiple people are owning it, we'll talk about that in the leases and why it's important to have that. You don't know if land is worth it to rent. You don't know what the land is worth monetary wise, how much you should charge, but also as more and more people are being removed from the farm, and as it's getting passed down, there's less of that emotional attachment to the ground. It's that overwhelming sense of responsibility of, do I want to keep it or do I want to sell it and maybe reinvest my money in something else that I'm more passionate about. That's something that farm families really struggle with. Really, is it the worst thing if your heirs sell your ground? That's for you to decide. But owning land often comes with a huge land management learning curve. And so we are here to help you with that at the Center for Ag Profitability. So if you ever have questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us. I'm sure you are not the first one to ask it, and you will not be the last. There's also the question of who's responsible for what expenses. Again, are you in a verbal lease or a written lease? And oftentimes, land is in a trust or estate or still in probate that first year, or potentially 2 or 3 years after somebody passed away. And so how do you manage both the income and expenses with that piece of ground, right? These are all common things. We're here to help you with that. You're not alone. So let's dive into a little bit about understanding a agricultural lease and their clauses. We're going to do a couple quick basic introductions of when I say landowner or landlord, there can be multiple or it can be one. We often use those words interchangeable. It's the one who actually owns the ground. The tenant or operator is often the farmer or the rancher who's doing the work, but oftentimes you'll see tenant or operator switched back and forth between those. If you are making a lease, I would say make sure that you are having the common language in each lease, whether you are using landowner all the time or landlord all the time, tenant or operator. Just make sure that you're being consistent with your lease. If you have a farm manager, you might include them in a lease as well, just so that everybody knows who to contact, who's responsible for what. If you have a farm manager, include them. We often say, everything is negotiable, but get it in writing. And truly it is. If you are a landowner or a tenant, you guys can agree upon whatever you guys want in a lease. You just have to have the other party agree with it. And I also like to say, let's make it reasonable, right? I work for Nebraska. I wear red. Should I have a lease that says only a certain color tractor can farm my ground? I don't really think that's reasonable, but if you want that in your lease, go ahead and put it in there. You just have to have somebody who's willing to follow that lease. Also, let's make sure it makes sense. But let's get our leases in writing. We can agree upon whatever else as long as we have it in writing. Okay. If I am wanting to get a written lease or if I am evaluating a written lease, what should be the bare minimum in a lease? A lot of times, I hear people say, well, those leases are too long. What is the bare minimum that I should have? Well, the first would be the names and addresses of every landowner and tenant. And I also like to have a cell phone number in there, just so in case something happens, you know how to get a hold of them other than just mailing a letter or some sort of communication that way. You also need the legal description of the ground. So that's typically the long 1/2 north, whatever that legal description for that ground is. Put that in the lease as well. And then how many tillable acres are present in the ground as well as pasture. I like to specify exactly how many tillable acres are on the ground because if you are charging cash rent, that's what you should be charging that cash rent on the tillable acres. You can find that at FSA or crop insurance or how many acres of pasture. That way you know how to set your stocking rate. All of this we'll cover it later on in the presentation. But I really like to say, like, of this X amount of ground, this is how many tillable acres. These are the waterways. This is the pasture. This makes up my piece of ground because it makes it easier to break down how to charge for it. Then you are also needing to consider the length of the lease. What is your start date and what is your end date? Most of the time in Nebraska, we see them start on March 1. And that's, I think, simply because if you have a verbal lease, it starts on March 1. And so they just like to keep that continuity. But again, if you have a written lease, you can pick whatever dates that you want. Just make sure they make sense. I also like to have how termination is going to be given if it needs to be given. I have more on that on the next slide. But how much notice do you need to give? Is it one no notice? Is it 6 months notice? What do you need? And then what is that permitted use of the land? Is it farming? Is it logging every single tree? Is it converting your farm ground to pasture? What is that permitted use of the land that you want to give the tenant the control over, and then as well as your signatures and dates. Again, every lease is going to be a little bit different depending on where you're living, what's being planted, uh, what the region is. But this is my general rule of thumb. These are your bare minimums that you should have. So when I talked about your length of the lease, a lot of times we see a 1 year lease, and that is simply it's being rented from 1 year to the next year. It typically ends on the last day of the lease. So with a lease written like this, which would say the lease is from March 1 to the end of February, this lease is terminated on the last day of February, or some similar type of wording. It technically does not need a termination notice with it. However, I do like just putting a termination notice that if you want to change it, I'm going to give you so much notice. I'm going to give you the professional courtesy before tenants start purchasing inputs for the next year. I really encourage that professional courtesy of just that and as much advance notice as you can. 1 year leases are great. They have greater flexibility, but what people don't like about them is they are a lot more paperwork. It's a lot more, making sure that you sign it every single year, which is why a lot of people goes into different multiple year leases situations. I think 1 year leases are the way to go, especially if you are in a new relationship between a tenant and landowner. If it's a established relationship, I think then we can look at more multiple year leases or auto renewing leases. Let's go over those a little bit. A multiple year lease, it's when you can rent to them for 5 years, 10 years. I've seen some that are 20 years. I think the length of the lease needs to be realistic, right? If I am 90, I'm probably not going to be signing a super long-term lease. But I think it is acceptable to say a 5 year lease if they are putting in some nutrients, if they're putting on a pivot. It really enables people to build that soil fertility with them thinking that they're going to get the use of their investment back, that the tenant's going to get their investment back if I have a multi-year lease. I also see a lot of multi-year leases when tenants put a pivot on rented ground because they know that they're going to be able to use that investment for a while without having to move it off after 1 year. And then I see a lot of auto renewing or holdover leases. I have that start. Because, again, I think this is only really applicable if you have that established relationship. So, what a auto renewing or holdover lease is, it says that I'm going to rent from you. It's going to be from year to year And unless I give you a termination notice, it's just going to auto renew. That is legal as long as you have how termination is going to be given. If you have a 1 year lease and you just say, yep, everything's great, let's just do that again next year, you guys don't have any termination notice in it, you don't have any clause like that. If it goes to court, you're going to go back to verbal lease law because that isn't technically legal. I think with a multiple year lease or an auto renewing lease, if you are in a cash rent lease, that you need to have a clause in there that states that you are going to adjust that cash rent every single year. Let's move with the market, both up and down. I think that's a really important part with auto renewing or multiple year lease, and that's why we kind of see some more 1 year leases where we haven't in the past when they were all verbal leases. So we talked a little bit about verbal lease law. Let's go over the basics of a verbal lease law. If you do not have a written lease at all for cropland, the length of the lease is 12 months. It starts March 1 and it goes for the entire year to the last day of February. If you have a verbal lease or a handshake agreement, the tenant has complete control of that land during the 12 months, meaning that unless you have a written lease that you retain rights, they can file trespassing charges on you if you enter that ground. They can sublease it. They can have every single tree in your beautiful windbreak logged. They have complete use of it. Hopefully you don't have a tenant that does that because let's be honest, if they log every single one of your windbreak trees, they're probably going to be getting a termination notice. But just know that if you have a verbal lease, the tenant has complete control of that ground for 12 months for farmland. If you want to change it or terminate your tenant, those changes or termination has to be received by the other party, by September 1. So prior to, not on September 1, before September 1, because verbal lease law for cropland states that termination has to be given 6 months prior to the start of the lease. So before September 1, any changes or termination has to be given. If it's after that, technically, they can refuse to. They have the right to farm it. If you have a tenant that cannot farm it this year, I get asked a lot of times, what do we do? Do we force them to farm it? If you are the owner of the land and you have a tenant who can no longer farm that piece of ground, don't make them farm it. Chances are you're going to be able to find a new tenant fairly easily. So that's a common question that we see a lot, that they just don't know what their rights are. Okay. So if you have a cash rent where you are charging a certain amount, a guaranteed amount by the acre, what is the bare minimums that you should have in your lease? Well, the first one is, when do you need money, right? That's the first question you should ask. And then how much money do you need? How are you setting that rental rate? So let's go into the first, when is payment due? Ideally, we like to see payment split up into at least 2 payments because it keeps the payments not on a line of credit where they are charging 10% interest on the cash rent. It makes it a little bit easier to cash flow things. It also enables people to have money when taxes are due. So ideally, we like to see it at least into 2 different payments. What is the cash rental rate? How are you charging them? Are you going to use our Nebraska rental rates? Are you going to use the USDA county rental rates? I'm not going to go over what those actual rates are today because one, they change all the every single year, and also more importantly, our new rental rates at Nebraska with the Center for Ag Profitability is going to be released in the next couple of weeks. So if you want, you can sign up for our webinar coming up. We're going to be having those rental rates available. But then how is that rental rate figured? Ideally, like I said, if you're charging by the acre, it should be the hay ground should have one price per acre. The farmable ground should have another price per acre. It really makes it fair, that you're not charging those lesser productive grounds the same price as you would a an acre of tillable farm ground. Okay, so that's your first question. That is your bare minimum for your cash rental rates. And then for a crop share, what are your bare minimums in your crop share? Where we remember that the landowner and the tenant are sharing in this situation. Each one is putting in inputs, each one is receiving their share of the crop back. So the first question is, how much is each person getting? Typically, what we see in Nebraska are 50-50, 60-40s, one-third, two-thirds, some 70-30s. When I say those numbers, that smaller amount is going to the landowner. And it kind of really depends on where you are at regionally in Nebraska. On the eastern side, we see a lot of 50-50s in the irrigated ground areas. We see 50-50s. When we move into southeast, south central, less productive ground, we're seeing those 60-40s where we don't have that irrigation potential. Our yields just are not higher. And then as we move out west, we see one-third, two-third splits. And really, it kind of follows how risky it is to farm in the state of Nebraska. On the eastern side, we see a lot of rain and we have a much higher yield potential than we do out in the western panhandle. And then I also like to see the bare minimums in the crop share of what expenses are going to be shared. You know, it's going to be different in the eastern side than it is out in the panhandle. So it really kind of depends on where you're at, what crops you're growing, when what the expenses are on what is shared. But I do have this general rule of thumb, crop expenses are shared in a crop share arrangement. So in this, the landowner is going to pay all the land taxes, and if they own any irrigation equipment, they're going to pay for, the operation, maintenance, insurance, depreciation, major repairs, all of that. The tenant is going to provide the labor, any minor repairs. They're going to cover the field operations, and they're also going to take the landowner's share of the crop to the elevator. So, what is share? It is crop insurance if you purchase it. You don't have to, but yield increasing inputs are shared. So, your fertilizer during the growing season, insecticide, fungicide, herbicide, and energy for irrigation, those are all shared. Seed is kind of a wild card. I am working on a crop share survey and I'm kind of seeing seed is all over the place. I have pockets where it is shared, I have pockets where it's not. And really, when you break it down, seed is something that probably should be considered to be shared because it is a very high input cost and it does reduce the need of insecticide, fungicide, potentially herbicide costs. So look at your expenses. A crop share is going to need a lot more communication than a basic cash rent arrangement. That's kind of, we're going to talk a lot about building the communication between a landowner and a tenant, and then each one's going to market your share of crop. I hear a lot from landowners who are recently inheriting ground. They are in a crop share. It is oftentimes overwhelming for them because they have never, wrote checks this large for different insecticide, fungicide, herbicide, whatever the case it is, or they don't, it's budgeting to pay for those taxes the next year. So if you inherited a crop share, become good friends with that tenant if you're keeping them, and then just make sure that you are asking those questions. Like, when are those expenses going to come for? What am I paying for? If you are not comfortable marketing your grain, if you have an established relationship, I think it's okay for you to ask your tenant, hey, can you market your grain when you market my grain? I don't feel comfortable with it. I trust you. If that trust is there, I think this is a great way to go about it. You can set some parameters if you want. If you don't, that's up to you too. Um, I do think, though, that this is the marketing of the grain is one thing that new landowners are very intimidating about, and I understand it. A lot of tenants are also intimidated with it too, right? It's that whole gamble of am I selling at the high or should I have waited? You're not the only one who thinks that, but just know that if you're not comfortable with it, there's farm managers, your tenant can help you out. Um, Contact us. We have ideas for you. Okay. And then this is just that crop share survey. If you're interested, if you have a crop share survey, you can participate in it. I'm hoping by the summer I have enough crop share survey results that I can spit out some regionalized crop shares that a 60/40 in this area shares these expenses, while a 50/50 in this area shares these expenses. So once that is ready to go, watch for a webinar on that. So let's talk a little bit more about specifically just farmland. And then we'll go into pasture and then some general clauses that we need to be thinking about. If I want to make my lease a little bit longer, a little bit more detailed, I think that's an okay approach. So the first question is, what are your expectations for that farm ground, right? Let's talk about proper farming practices. One example would be, am I following the natural resources guidelines? Or if I am in an area where the ground is terraced, am I following the terraces or am I farming over the terraces, right? We want to make sure that our ground is being taken care of. So if you want to protect it, make sure that you have that in a lease. If you have an organic piece of ground and you want to keep it organic, make sure that is in a lease. If you have a piece of ground that is no-till, one thing I might kind of consider some caution in a specific clause against any tillage on your ground, simply for the fact of sometimes a light tillage is needed to fix some ditches on the backside of terraces or where everything was parked. And by having an absolute no-till consideration in a clause, they can't go fix things without breaking a lease. So, have that conversation of what are your expectations for that ground? Who is responsible for maintaining waterways and terraces? Who's responsible for potentially bailing those terraces, or I mean waterways, sometimes terraces, or mowing them? If you have an area or you like your road ditches mowed and sprayed and those non-crop acres, who's responsible for those? Again, if you have that expectation, you need to communicate it with your tenant. You can add a clause in if you want, or if you have a really good relationship, just have that communication with them. It goes a long ways, but communicate what those expectations are. This next one, let's talk about soil fertility. I have the mining of the soils start again. And again, I think it's if you have a new relationship with a landowner tenant, this is something that is more applicable than if you've had a well-established one. And why it is mining of the soil. I think when economic times are tough, we want to make sure that our soil is still being taken care of. And so with that, we need to make sure that we're not using up all of the nutrients in the soil and that if we are using a lot, we're putting that same amount back in. So if you have a new relationship as a landowner, you might consider having a soil test done. And then at the end of that lease, whenever you decide that you want a new tenant. So, I think it's different if it's 1 year or 5 years, or you might not even need to do that second test if they know that it's a good relationship. But especially in a new relationship, consider having a soil test done. And then at the end of the lease, you compare it and make sure it's within similar ranges. A minimum amount of nutrients need to be left into that field. If you're thinking about this, talk to an agronomist, see what would be an ideal range or an ideal figure. But it is something that we are, actively telling people to think about in new relationships, because you don't want to have a tenant who just strips all of the nutrients out of your ground. It's going to be hard for you to find a new tenant, because everybody else in the neighborhood who farms is going to know that it's going to take a lot of money to put those nutrients back into the ground. If you're in an area that has a lot of manure application, I just talked about stripping nutrients out of the soil, but on the other hand, sometimes too much is a good thing is not what we want. And so manure application, you might consider having a clause in there that limits how much is applied each year. Now, if your ground needs improvement, whether that is a lot of nutrients added back in because the soil nutrients were kind of mined, or if you need lime, you might consider a multi-year lease with the clause in there that you still have the rights to terminate that tenant. However, if you terminate that tenant before the lifetime of that lime or other nutrients is used up, you will prorate that expense back to them. Why is this the case? Well, whether it's lime or another nutrient, if you terminate that lease, they can't go and pick up that nutrient and take it with them, right? It typically stays in the soil. That's why we consider lime a landlord expense. And lime is probably an issue more on the eastern side of the state than it is on the western side. But what this clause does is says that if I am renting from you and you decide to terminate me after 2 years, lime is typically good for 5 years. So if I'm terminated after 2 years, 40% of that lime has been used. So you're going to pay me 60% of my investment towards that lime back to me because I don't get to use it. Lime's a landlord expense typically, but if you are in a cash rent situation, landlords typically don't want to pay for a lime. And so this is one way to make sure that your ground is being taken care of by the tenant. It protects the tenant and the landowner. And this is a clause that if you're making a large, or if your tenant is putting a large amount of money back into the ground, you need to be thinking about having these clauses in a written lease, not just a verbal lease. So let's also talk about yields. I get asked a lot about, can we ask for yields? Well, it depends on what kind of lease you have. If you have a verbal cash rent or a cash rent that's even written lease and you don't have anything about yields, they do not have to share any of their past yields with you or even the current yield. Now, remember, I said you can put whatever you want in a lease. So you can put it in a lease that they have to share their yields with you going forward. That's legal. They don't have to share what's been done in the past, but they would have to share what's happening in the future. If you're a crop share, your tenant has to share the yields with you, more than just, certifying it at the crop insurance, whatever that case might be. They have to share your yields if you're in a crop share because the tenant and the tenant and the landowner are both operators. So if you have on-farm storage with a crop share, remember you're part operator too if you're a landowner. If you're having that situation where your tenant is having on-farm storage, you might consider requesting for scale tickets or the certification, how when they measured grain bins and did that estimation. It's a little bit trickier, but it is doable, and they still have to share those yields with you for crop share. Cash rent, just going on if you put it in a lease. Okay. So irrigation equipment. When you look at the cash rent figures that are published, It's making the general assumption that all ownership costs is going to the landowner. So they own the pivot, the pump, they have the depreciation costs, the insurance costs on it. If that's the case, it's okay and common for tenants to provide some of the upkeep or the repairs in on the pivot, on the power unit, whether that's changing oils, changing nozzles, whatever the case might be. But make sure that you put it in a lease. I oftentimes see clauses in a lease for irrigation equipment saying that the tenant is going to cover the first 500, $1,000 in repairs, and then anything above that is going to go to the landowner. Okay. But put it in a lease. Otherwise, all of those repair costs are the landowners. If that pivot is being purchased by the tenant, then the rent needs to be adjusted, and there are calculations or survey results to say how much should that rent be adjusted by. And then again, if the tenant is putting a pivot on your ground, you probably need to look at a multi-year lease, just because that's going onto your ground. It's a big investment. Protect your investment, your ground, and their investment as well. It protects both parties. Okay. With irrigation, let's also talk about water usage. So some natural resources districts severely regulate water usage. Some are a little bit more relaxed. So depending on where you are in the state of Nebraska, each natural resource district is going to have different regulations. If you are inheriting a piece of ground that you think this might be, either you can talk to a lawyer or you call the natural resource district, talk to your tenant, see if this applies for you. If it does, your lease needs to address those groundwater rights, right? Some are limited that so much can be used in 5 years. Some are limited by so much in 1 year. But whatever that is, you need to make sure that you have it in a lease that they are using the water rights available to them, not overusing it, because if they overuse it, you terminate them, you're still going to be having that consequence for either the new tenant, the new owner, whatever that case might be, if you go on in the future. So make sure that you are protecting your ground, your water rights as well. I do have a resource at the end that you can find where your ground is and what natural resources district you are located in. Okay. And then commonly in leases, we often find that corn stalks are not addressed in leases. And this is probably one of the big things that kind of become a little bit of a conflict point among tenants and landowners. So the first question is, who owns the stalks? If it's cash rent, the tenant owns all the stalks. If it's a crop share, the tenant and landowner owns the stalks. So let's first talk about grazing. Who gets to graze? My rule of thumb is if it's a tenant's cattle going on there, the tenant is taking care of them, they're putting up the fence. I say just let them have the corn stalks, because it's going to probably reduce some volunteer corn. It's putting nutrients back in the soil. It's getting rid of some trash out there. If it's somebody else's cattle coming onto the ground and they are subleasing it, I think then I think it's okay for you to ask for a portion of that money to come back to you, especially if you're in a crop share arrangement. And then baling it, where they go in, they bale the corn stalks and remove all the material. That's not what you want. You never want your ground to be completely bare, because it really opens the land up for risk to have erosion on it. So make sure that your ground has a clause in it. Your lease has a clause that states that no more than, I would say, probably 60% of the corn stalks are baled. And recently this year, I have started to say throughout the entire field. You don't want to have 60% on one side of the field completely baled and 40% on the other side. And I saw that driving somewhere. And so I have been kind of adjusting this presentation a little bit to say there needs to be 40% cover across all the field if you're going to be bailing it. Because what happens if you are on a verbal lease or you do not have any specifications on bailing, if you terminate myself, I have the right, especially if I cash rent, to go bail 100% of every corn stalk on that field. And we don't want that, right? We want that ground to be protected. We want our investment to be protected. So we talked a little bit about farm ground leases and what I think, we need to think about. The other one is let's talk about pasture leases. So for a verbal pasture lease, so you're having a handshake arrangement, the law says that it is 5 months of the year. So whether you go in March or May 15th or June 1st, it's 5 months from whenever they enter that arrangement or that pasture. So with that, they're only effective during that time. You don't technically have to follow the 6-month termination guidelines that you would for cropland because it's only during those 5 months that you are renting it. However, our extension attorney, Dave Aiken, he's an amazing resource. He commonly says that this issue has not been taken to court yet. So this is just kind of how the law reads right now. And so it could go to court and that could change in the future, but this is right now how we understand it. However, if we know that we're going to sell a piece of ground or we're going to have a new tenant take over our pasture, let the other person know as soon as we can. We don't want to be standing in front of the gates of the pasture saying, you shall not enter, you do not have the rights to graze this, right? We want to give them well enough notice and to practice that common courtesy and be good neighbors to each other. So, for a pasture lease provision, what do you need to be thinking of? Well, first off, how are you charging rent? Are you charging by cow-calf pair, per acre, per day, per month for the entire season? How are you wanting to calculate that? And then also, what is your stocking rate going to be? When we talk about stocking rates, some people use animal unit months. That's more out on the western side. And on the eastern side, we see more head per acre allotments. Every region is going to be a little bit different on how many head per acre or animal units that your pasture can safely have. We don't want overgrazing. So if you have any questions on that, talk to those beef educators. They can really give you a good idea of what your pasture can sustain. And then also, what happens if they are early in or laid out penalty? Are you having a fee? Do you have a reduced stocking rate next year? Those are some things to be thinking about, as well as who does what, right? The more a tenant does, whether it is on a farm ground or pasture, the more they do, ideally, the cheaper the rent is, right? Because they're contributing back to it. So, cattle care typically is a tenant, right? But if the landowner is doing the care, that's gonna go up. The minor repairs on the fence, I say those general maintenance repairs are the tenant's responsibility. The going in and tightening up the fence, the taking care of some cedar trees here and there, the minor repairs, that is a tenant's job to do. Now, the larger repairs, if the whole fence needs to be replaced, typically what we see for that is the tenant does the labor and the landowner supplies the equipment. Same for noxious weeds. The tenant does the labor, the landowner typically pays for the chemical, right? But who does what for your lease? Again, you guys can decide whatever you want to. It's going to come down to whatever you guys agree upon. But really, kind of who is the general rule of thumb responsibilities? The tenant, if you fertilize your pasture, the tenant's going to pay for that as well as any probably noxious weed control, they generally do the labor. The landlord, kind of both parties are really responsible for making sure that cedars are taken care of, fences, infrastructure. And a lot of times in the pasture, we see that shared responsibility because both parties are responsible for making sure that the grass is protected and maintained and not overgrazed. So with that, we have this early removal of cattle provision. And so what is this? It's if there's a fire, hail, drought, and there's not enough grass in that pasture, we want to make sure that it's not overgrazed like the right-hand side of this photo here. We want to make sure that our grass is protected and that we are not facing consequences from this multiple years down the road. So if I'm having a pasture lease, I need to have in there that if the grass is not sustainable, how am I going? Do I have the ability to remove those cattle to pay a portion of that rental rate to the landowner? And then how much notice is given? What's the discounted rate? And then I really highly suggest any changes on this, whether it is a clause in there, have written documentation needed. And I really urge this written documentation simply for the fact of if you and I have an agreement and one of us passes away, do our heirs know this, right? I don't want to have a bad relationship with my new landowners because they are thinking I didn't pay my full amount, right? So that's why we want that written documentation that we made these changes to protect the grass here. Any changes, let's have it written down. Okay. So the landowner's best practices. Overall, if you have any management expectations for your farm or ranch, let the tenants know. Whether it's weed control, erosion control, what the expectations are for the road ditches, let them know what those expectations are. And also, if you have a farmstead that's not being used, let them know what the expectations are for that. Do they get to rent that Quonset? Do they get to use those dry lots? Do they need to mow around the house to keep it looking nice? If you have those expectations, let the other party know. The more you ask them to do, you might need to reflect it in the contract. But it's okay to make sure that your wishes are known so that there's not that potential for misunderstandings and disgruntlements in the future. Okay. Then let's also talk about subleasing clause. Can your tenant sublease? So this is when they can rent out the ground to somebody else, whether it's hunting rights, fishing rights, farming the ground, whatever the case might be. Do you want the tenant the ability to sublease, whether it's corn stalks, hunting, and what do you want them to sublease that? How much limitations do you want to give them or not? Can your tenant bring in a partner? So ideally what this looks like is if they're farming one on like just them and they bring in a kid, does this contract apply to their kid as well? Can they bring in that partner? Do you need written consent to sublease? I would say if you have any subleasing done, that you should request that written consent because we want to make sure who has access to our ground, right? It prevents that unknown operators that we don't want somebody to sublease it, not know who's out there, not know that potentially those rights are given away for that piece of ground. If you have a piece of ground that has utilities, specifically like grain bins, for example, who's paying for the electricity for those grain bins, pivots, water meters? Who's paying the propane, all of that? Make sure you're out guidelining who is paying for those utilities. If you have a piece of ground that is right next to your homestead, maybe there's some grain bins on there. I would highly suggest you take the additional cost to put up a meter so that they can just be billed separately from your own farmstead. Yes, it's an additional cost, but I do think it is beneficial for keeping that, tenant landowner relationship out from your own personal expenses, right? If we see conflicts regarding rights, oftentimes they are farming everything just fine, but the some conflicts arise because of recreational usage, right? Maybe the landowner's heirs want to go hunt, but they can't because the tenant has a right to hunt. So if you want the right to hunt your ground, to fish your ground, to go ride horses on your ground, you have to have a clause in your written lease that states that you are keeping that right. Otherwise, it goes to the tenant. If there's no clause or it's a verbal lease, the tenant has full use of that land. If you are letting people hunt, right, there are some liability concerns, but there is a law that says Nebraska recreational use law, as long as you didn't booby trap, you didn't charge, you don't know of any dangers out there, you're not liable for them getting hurt on your ground, right? And I think it's also different what you give rights to. Let's say you give your tenant the ability to hunt your ground. Does that just mean the tenant and maybe their kids, or does that mean the tenant and five friends can hunt your piece of ground, right? How much do you want to give that tenant? Or do you want to keep all of those rights as a landowner? If you want to keep them, you have to have it written down in a lease. And then also we see a lot or we hear a lot about the first right of refusals. So what this is the tenant has the first chance to lease or buy the ground, or sometimes it's also family. So, leasing first right of refusal and selling, oh, sorry, I skipped that one. There we go. Selling first right of refusals kind of operate similarly, but they have their differences. A lot of times when it comes to family, it's that family has that first right of refusal to lease it, but they can give it up, right? Same with ground. They have the chance to buy it. They're the first ones offered, but they don't have to. So if you're doing a first right of refusal, I would say you need to have how much timeline do they have to respond, yes or no? And then at what price? Is it the fair market price? Is it, a reduced rate that we often see for families? Sometimes we see the county appraisal being the price. What does that look like for your tenant? What what guidelines do they need to meet before a certain amount? And it's kind of it gives that long-term flexibility that they know that they're going to have it. They have the first right of refusal. It gives you the flexibility that you can ask them first. You can feel okay that you ask them, but it doesn't have to. A lot of tenants at a farm ground have been tenants for many, many years. So they have that emotional attachment that you likely have. So they want the chance to be the first ones to purchase it. First right of refusal is not set up to be a bidding war, right? So if you had somebody offer $10,000 for your piece of ground, I'm just going to use some easy numbers here. It's not, well, go to your first right of refusal, your tenant. Well, they offered me $10,000 and I'm going to take it. If your tenant says yes, that's how it's supposed to work. It's not supposed to work like your tenant says yes, 10,000. Well, then you go back to the other party. Well, now it's 12,000. Yes, it's not supposed to be like that. It's just you want to reciprocate how they have treated the ground throughout the many years. If you are thinking about having this in your lease, you probably need to get an attorney involved because it's just good insurance. Okay. I'm about done here. So then also what happens if somebody defaults or if there's remedies clauses? So what happens if somebody forgets to pay or you don't get the check in time? What happens if they have damage to the property, unauthorized use? The first step I would say is first talk to them, call them up on the phone, and then also give them the opportunity to cure them potentially. So if it's the check got lost in the mail and it was honestly a check lost in the mail, not just the supposed situations, give them the opportunity to cure it. Otherwise, you can go right into termination options that is terminated then, regardless of if it's a long-term lease or a holdover lease. But, depending on the situation is going to make your decision on the opportunity to cure or not. And then if there are disputes, how to go fix it. This resolution clause is a good way. You can start on one-on-one meetings, mediation, arbitration, court should be your last resort. know that most of these have a cost associated with them. And if you are in a dispute, don't forget about Rural Response Hotline. The phone number is listed, and I will have a link at the very end. The call is free. They give legal advice, financial advice. They're a really great source of information if you have these specific questions. And then if you are offered a lease arrangement, or you are talking to a current land tenant and you are a landowner, how do you compare that rental rate or that scenario that they are given to you? First off, I would say use the published data and not just the coffee shop talk. Sometimes it's better to have a tenant that maybe can't pay top dollar, but they are treating your ground really good, rather than the tenant who is offering top dollar, but isn't treating your ground well. Remember, a good tenant is probably better, especially if they talk to you. A lot of times I hear from landowners, their tenant isn't great at communication. So try to work on that. It goes both ways. And do you want flexibility or certainty in your lease? And then I often get asked, do we need to have an attorney write the lease? No, you don't. If you and both parties are really comfortable with each other, you guys trust each other, I think your lease can be a lot shorter and you might not need an attorney. However, especially in any new arrangement, I think your lease is going to be longer, and it is a good insurance policy to have an attorney look over your tenant and landlord agreement. Have them look it over. It's going to be a lot longer just because that relationship is a little bit more uncertain. If you're looking for examples of leases, if you go to this aglease101.org, you click on Document Library. On the right-hand side, you have all of these form fillable PDFs. And what they are is they're examples of leases. And I say, take them and use what you will of it, right? I don't think it's something that you should just print off and sign it, but take what you want out of it and leave what you don't. Make it work for you and your ground. And then we have 4 different educators across the state. We are all very well versed in these topics. We're all very willing to help you. Give us a call. And then here is a list of resources that I kind of talked about throughout the time, as well as lease law, fence law, and other links that you might find beneficial. Are there any questions?
Yeah, thank you very much, Anastasia. Thanks everybody for getting questions in. We'll get to those here. Let's see, what sort of costs are involved in soil testing and who might you contact to do this?
Yeah. So it kind of depends on what region you are. A lot of times the local elevators, or different agronomy services, they will have those soil testing facilities. If you want to do like the full grid sampling, it's gonna be a little bit of an expense. If you want to do a much lower cost, where it's probably going to be maybe $50 a sample. If you want the very, very detailed test, you can go to the local, like to the soil lab at UNL and get a soil test done, or Ward Laboratories, and you can take this soil sample. We have resources on how to take a good soil sample, and you can do that yourself. It kind of depends on how much do you want to spend and how detailed do you want your soil test to be.
Awesome, thank you. Is there a benchmark or index that we should use to increase cash rents annually? How do you approach that?
Yeah, so cash rents should move up or down with with the markets, right? A lot of times we forget about that down part. So we every single year have the Nebraska land values document. And that is here. I'm going to click on this link here and drag it over. And so this is a really good source of how to find like what the average rate is. Now, whether it is a USDA numbers or the Nebraska numbers, right? It's only as good as the information we get. So they're just starting points. There's a lot of things that go into factoring rental rates, whether it is, sorry, I'm trying to bring this up here, whether it is like how big the ground is, how easy it is to farm, how close it is to your situation. Those are all things that we need to consider. So this website here would be that land leasing. And so we have the USDA numbers on here. We have our Nebraska numbers, which will be released in the next couple weeks. But as a flat line index, I don't think that is a reasonable way to adjust cash rent every single year.
Well, thank you. Question if you would recommend giving a trusted tenant my USDA power of attorney and authority to sign for crop insurance.
Yep. So I think if you have a good, trusted tenant, I think, yes, go ahead and give them that power of attorney at FSA office. It doesn't mean that they can sign, it doesn't mean that they can sell your ground, but it does help you not have to sign every little detail thing that maybe is kind of monotonous for them. I think it's also great to have that tenant be able to sign up the crop insurance too. Say that this is, yes, this is what we planted, this is how many acres, this is the yields that we got. Then it's still up to you to decide how much crop insurance you are going to purchase and at what levels you're going to have or who you want to even use for crop insurance. So I think it's a good idea if you trust them. Yeah. Saves you some hassle.
Perfect. Dave Aiken, our wonderful extension ag law specialist, who you mentioned during the webinar here, he did chime in and mentioned that the pasture lease statute, there is no pasture lease statute actually, but it's all dependent on lawyers basically guessing, attorneys guessing based on what courts might do in a pasture case. So no pasture lease law yet in Nebraska, he said. 5 months is based on the typical grass growing season. So thank you, Dave, very much. Anastasia, is there anywhere to find out common rates for storage bins specifically?
Yeah, so that Ag Lease 101, go back to it. So this is probably as good as the information as we're going to get published data wise. It does have different things like farm building rental rates where like if you call me and you ask what is a Quonset going for, what is a grain bin going for, I'm gonna pull these numbers up because it's the only published data that I have. However, I'm going to tell you that these were last published in 14. I think there's some trying to be some grants to update them, but it's a lot more expensive now to publish or to build this stuff than it was back then. So you're probably going to need to be adjusting that rental rate. What I see when I talk to people about grain bins is it's usually 10 cents to 20 cents for the per bushel for the entire year. If you're renting a grain bin, first of all, have a different meter on it. And then you also want to charge a yearly rate. You don't want to do the whole month rate because if I'm paying per month, that is the first grain bin that I am going to empty and it's going to be the last one I fill because I don't want to pay that much rent on it. So make sure that you are charging a yearly rate, and it also depends on the size of your grain bin, right? This 3,000 bushel grain bins, we say just let them have it. It being used, it's being taken care of. That functionality of it is pretty minimal. But as you get larger, like the 10,000, 30,000 especially, right? How big they are is going to adjust whether it's closer to that 10 cents per bushel or that 20 cents per bushel range.
Great, thank you. Here's a good one for this webinar, especially if you inherit land mid-lease, does the lease continue or should a new one be created?
Yes, so if you inherit a lease mid-year, that lease carries on to the new owners. Also, if your tenant dies mid-year, that lease carries on to his heirs, so that his heirs can get the crop out. So yes, it carries on throughout the end of the lease for both parties.
Great. I don't see any other questions right now, so I really want to thank everybody for joining the webinar today, and thank you, Anastasia, for a great presentation. When you close out today, you'll see our usual short survey that just asks you for your feedback on today's webinar and how it went, and if you have any ideas for future webinars. And as always, we really appreciate that feedback. And we have a couple more questions here I'll get to
Okay.
the end. But as you sign out, though, I just want people to be aware of that survey. And again, thank you very much for attending today. We hope you'll keep up with the Center for Ag Profitability because we have a lot going on here this time of year. And you can follow us on our website at cap.unl.edu. Anastasia, another clarification, I guess, is the bushel rate 10 to 20 cents per bushel per year or per month?
Per year. That rate is per year.
And then a comment from somebody, thank you, Robert, says, I have in the past used half of the commercial storage rate for grain storage on an annual basis. So,
Yep. That's a good way to go about it. It's kind of depending on where you are in the state, that's kind of the 10 to 15 or 10, 15, 20 cent per bushel. A lot of times I see people like those easier numbers to figure because it's easier to remember. But thank you. Yes.
great. All right. Well, I think we can go ahead and wrap it up now. Thanks again, everybody, for attending today with us. And Anastasia, thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great afternoon, everyone.